I had been babysitting for years, and it was one of my regular gigs, but this one, I'll never forget. A single mom, Miss Caldwell, called me to watch her son, Toby, on a Friday night. She was going out with friends and wouldn't be back until after midnight. I arrived at the house a little before 7 p.m. It was one of those large, Victorian-style homes that looked out of place in the modern neighborhood. The house felt off. The way it towered over the street gave me chills, but I brushed it off as just another very old house. Miss Caldwell greeted me at the door, her face tight and anxious. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, almost as if she was relieved to see me. "Toby's already asleep upstairs. You shouldn't have any trouble with him. Just don't go into the basement." I nodded, unsure of why she was so adamant about the basement. After a few hurried instructions, she left. I locked the door and settled in with a book. But before long, I started hearing strange noises. It sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs, though I knew Toby was supposed to be asleep. I called out,
"Toby?"
but got no response. The footsteps stopped as soon as I spoke. Shrugging it off, I went back to reading, telling myself the old house was just creaky. But an hour later, a quiet thumping came from the basement. I froze. Miss Caldwell had warned me against going down there. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. Finally, I worked up the courage to head down the stairs, just to see if maybe something had fallen over. The basement door was padlocked from my side, which struck me as strange. But just as I turned to walk away, I heard a faint voice, a child's voice, whisper, "Help me." Chills shot down my spine. It sounded like a little boy. Like Toby, I knew I shouldn't open the door, but the voice was so weak, so scared. Carefully, I undid the padlock and opened the door just enough to peek down the stairs. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of decay. The weak light barely illuminated the first few steps. But at the bottom, I saw a small figure, pale, huddled, and shivering. I gasped. It was a boy around Toby's age, but it wasn't Toby. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale as snow. He was mouthing words, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, he raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at me. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. But as I locked it, I heard the basement stairs creak. Something was coming up. I stumbled back, locking the door and pushing a chair against it. For a few minutes, all was silent. But then, from the baby monitor beside me, I heard faint laughter. It was Toby. The monitor was in his room, but the laughter, it sounded distorted, almost like he was giggling and crying at the same time. Shakily, I went upstairs to check on him. I pushed his door open and found him sound asleep. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something in the corner of the room. A shadow that didn't belong to anything I could see. It loomed in the corner, tall and stretched like it was watching over Toby. My heart skipped a beat. The shadow seemed to shift, as if it noticed me too. I backed away, never taking my eyes off it. But as I reached the door, Toby opened his eyes, still half asleep. "Don't leave me alone," he whispered. It was such an innocent request, but his voice sounded strange. Like it wasn't his own. I stayed by his bedside, holding his hand, trying to comfort him. But as he drifted back to sleep, he whispered, "The boy in the basement. He wants to come upstairs." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Who was the boy in the basement? Why was Toby talking about him? I decided to call Miss Caldwell. She answered, her voice hurried and uneasy, as if she'd been expecting my call. "You heard him, didn't you?" she said, voice trembling. "The boy? I've tried to move, but he follows us. My husband, he found him one night, locked in the basement, and since then, we've been haunted." I didn't know what to say, fear gripping me as I looked down the dark hallway. Miss Caldwell continued, "If you can, get Toby out of the house, now." Before I could respond, the call disconnected. I was alone in a house with a spirit that clearly wanted something, or someone. The basement door creaked open downstairs. Holding Toby close, I ran for the front door. But as I reached for the lock, a cold hand gripped my wrist. I spun around, and there he was, the pale boy, standing right behind me. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and he mouthed a single word, "Stay." I stumbled back, yanking the door open and rushing outside with Toby. We waited until Miss Caldwell came home. I handed Toby to her, not saying a word about what I saw. I didn't want to frighten him or her any further. A few days later, I tried calling Miss Caldwell, but there was no answer. A week passed, and I stopped by her house, only to find it completely empty. They had moved overnight, leaving no trace behind. I haven't heard from them since. But every so often, when I'm alone at night, I hear that child's whisper, faint and pleading.
Help me!